In the aughts, horror movie characters were brutalized like never before, as filmmakers broke taboos with grotesque death traps, hellish Slovakian dungeons, and yes, human centipedes. The success of a small handful of films paved the way for a glut of extremely gruesome horror films dismissively dubbed torture porn, due to their graphic depictions of brutality. Some achieved their own success by capitalizing on the trend, while others failed to make any kind of mark whatsoever. So, what exactly is torture porn? It's one of those terms that different people seem to think means different things. As a result, there doesn't seem to be one standard definition. Maybe it'll be helpful to talk about what the subgenre is not. Torture porn is not, number 1, horror in general. This should go without saying, but during its run, many traditional media writers would simply latch on to the newest phrases that the youngsters were using and run with it, using the term as being synonymous with horror in general. This is obviously not the case. Number 2, sex and horror. Yes, this also seems obvious, but there are actually people out there that think when they hear the term torture porn, it refers to gratuitous sex and nudity in horror films.
In my next life, I want to come back as one of the buttons on the ass pocket of her jean shorts.
Number 3, bloody, gross, shocking kills. This is the big one. A lot of people will invoke the term torture porn to refer to films that have disgusting, over-the-top, or shocking kills. While it's true that this is part of it, on its own, it's not. If it was, every 80s slasher movie could be categorized as such, and that just wouldn't be applicable. Torture porn refers to a specific cycle of ultra-violent films that dominated the box office between 2004 and 2010-ish. Films that focus on the capture and torture of sympathetic characters who are subjected to extended and graphic torment, shot in spectacular close-ups that dwell on the details of the injury. Torture porn is part of the post-9/11 shift in the horror genre, expressing a resounding surge in fear of terrorism and of our own ambivalence about torture and invasive government surveillance. The controversial cycle emerged during a heightened period of national self-questioning and debate over the George W. Bush's administration's policy of, quote, enhanced interrogation.
What do you say to the argument that your proposal is basically seeking support for torture, coerced evidence, and secret hearings, and Senator McCain says your plan will put U.S. troops at risk? What do you think about that?
This debate is occurring because of the Supreme Court's ruling that said that we must conduct ourselves under the Common Article 3 of the Geneva Convention. And that Common Article 3 says that there will be no outrages upon human dignity. It's very vague. What does that mean? Outrages upon human dignity. That's a statement that is wide open to interpretation. And what I'm proposing is that there be clarity in the law so that our professionals will have no doubt that that which they're doing is legal.
Today, we will be revisiting this cycle. Every severed limb, every saw blade to the face, and everything in between. Let's begin. In 2003, director James Wan and screenwriter Lee Winnell created a short film to help pitch as a potential feature film. This was successfully done in 2004 with the release of the first Saw film at the Sundance Film Festival. The soon-to-be franchise follows the fictional character of John Kramer, also called the Jigsaw Killer, or simply Jigsaw. Rather than killing his victims out and out, Jigsaw traps them in situations that he calls games or tests to assess their will to live through physical or psychological torture. And indeed, the film spawned several sequels, ending its initial run with Saw Part 7 in 2010.
Do it! You gotta do it! You gotta kill him, Ron! Do it!
Stupid bitch!
Do it! Do it! Do it!
This means that for 7 years in a row, we came together on Halloween to share a sacred tradition with one another. and our millions, we united as a community for the sole purpose of watching unknown actors get cut, slashed, drilled, gutted, and blown up in a variety of sadistically inventive contraptions while we ate popcorn. This was a time when horror films were dominated by demonic, long-haired young women, either Japanese or based on Japanese characters, and a resurgence of zombies. The previous Halloween had also seen a gory remake of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre score well with audiences, and its success undoubtedly fed into Lionsgate's decision to give their low-budget Sundance purchase a theatrical release over a flashy direct-to-video slot. The UK marketing campaign led with the quote, "Dare you see Saw?", which helped to create the childlike one-upmanship that bled through the entirety of the subgenre it helped to create. When the original Saw was released, it was met with a flurry of, frankly, unfair criticism. Richard Roeper famously said that it was nothing but a glorified snuff film, and that he despised it for this very reason. And yes, Saw indeed ushered in the torture porn era, although the term would be applied to it ex post facto. However, if you were to rewatch the film today, you'll realize that it's not the gruesome parade of elaborate traps and mindless display of violence many see it as retroactively. Saw is no more an extreme horror exercise than David Fincher's Seven. Nevertheless, the first Saw movie has come to be regarded as the granddaddy of the torture porn subgenre, although the movie itself is comparatively light on gore. No doubt taking advantage of the success of the Saw series, Eli Roth's Hostel clawed its way into theaters and almost single-handedly revolutionized the torture porn genre. The gore and violence in the movie is so over-the-top and gruesome that it's physically tough to sit through many of the scenes, and that's exactly what director Roth seemed to be aiming for. The story itself deals with a group of youngsters who get captured and tortured by a mysterious and psychotic businessman in an Eastern European hostel.
Bitch. Fucking bitch!
I get a lot of money for you. And that make you my bitch.
Hostel is a film that's always been a bit smarter than it's given credit for. If you can get past the blood, guts, and eyeball goo, this is a film that reflects America's fear of the rest of the world and comments on how rampant consumer culture has become. Hostel is a film where you can buy anything, and everyone is for sale to the highest bidder. We see this early on with the main character's sex-filled journey through Europe, then realize its morbid implications when they become just another product for a willing buyer. Hostel isn't easy viewing, but it's actually a horror film with something to say.
I've been all over the world. I've been everywhere. And the bottom line is, pussy's pussy. I just fucked a girl 2 days ago and I don't even remember the color of her tits. But this is something you never forget, right?
In January 2006, New York Magazine's David Edelstein published an article titled, "Now Playing at Your Local Multiplex, Torture Porn." The piece name-checks and critiques Hostel, The Devil's Rejects, Saw, Wolf Creek, and even Mel Gibson's religious blockbuster, The Passion of the Christ. Explicit scenes of torture and mutilation were once confined to the old 42nd Street, The Deuce, and gut-bucket Italian pictures like Make Them Die Slowly, whereas now they have terrific production values and a place of honor in your local multiplex, Edelstein writes. As a horror maven who long ago made peace, for better and worse, with the genre's sadism, I'm baffled by how far this new stuff goes, and by why America seems so nuts these days about torture. In addition to the annual Saw sequel, 2006 saw the release of Turistas, about backpackers in Brazil who are captured by organ harvesters. Maybe the single most notable thing about the Brazil set film is that it was boycotted in Brazil due to its not so favorable portrayal of the country.
We have no money, we have no way out of here.
We'll be fine.
You think so?
Yeah.
Because I'm not so sure.
There's no shortage of bloodshed in this film, but one scene in particular has always stood out. After being captured by the aforementioned organ harvesters, a young woman makes a bold attempt to escape, running for her life through the jungle. What she doesn't realize, however, is that she's running out of land. She literally runs directly off a massive cliff in her attempt to escape their captors, brutally hitting her head on the side of the cliff before slamming to the ground below. It's 2007, yet more extreme horror hits cinemas, including the French movies Inside and Frontiers, and the Roth-directed Hostel 2. In June 2007, Ain't It Cool News publishes an interview with Roth in which the director takes issue with the term torture porn, or at least the idea that movies such as Hostel are solely about providing immediate gratification to fans of extreme horror. I think that I understand what David Edelstein said when he said audiences were getting off on the violence, Roth says. What that does, though, is it immediately discredits the film. You know, when you watch pornography, you watch it, you get off, and that's it. I think it's more reflective of the critic than the film. It shows a lack of understanding and ability to understand and appreciate a horror film as something more than just a horror film. The gore blinds them to any intelligence that goes into making the film, and I think the term torture porn genuinely says more about the critic's limited understanding of what horror movies can do than about the film itself. The year's releases also included The Girl Next Door, which follows the unspeakable torture and abuses committed on a teenage girl in the care of her aunt and the boys who witness and fail to report the crime. Based on a novel by
Jack Ketchum,
the heroine film is made a much harder watch by being based on a real case.
Anyone who's a slut deserves a thrashing. I'm sure anyone in this town would agree with me. I'm just warning you, honey. If I see any slutting going on around this house, your ass is grass and Auntie Ruth's the lawnmower.
The Girl Next Door is, objectively, quite a good movie. It's well written, well acted, well shot, and has bang-up period production design, and is legitimately terrifying. While the violence is shocking, if it was entirely fictional, it would be easier to deal with. But knowing that this tragedy happened to a real girl is emotionally shattering and devastating. It makes the film an endurance test to watch. Those with a strong will should well give it a shot, but be prepared. It's a tough sit. The French extreme wave of horror films delivered more than a few good to great horror movies. But while the majority focused on the expected culprits, or martyrs paired those terrors with ideas far more psychological. This blast furnace of a film follows Lucy, a young woman who is the victim of a childhood of unspeakable torture. She grows up in an orphanage, where her only friend is Anna, another young girl who almost becomes a mother-like figure for the child. Smash forward about 15 years, and only a few minutes into the film, we are treated to the spectacle of Lucy blowing a suburban family away with a double-barreled shotgun, Dirty Harry style. At this point, it seems relevant to point out that Martyrs is essentially two movies in one, and neither one is recommended for the squeamish. At the jump-off point, Martyrs rests gruesomely in home invasion territory, with Clive Barker-like supernatural elements mixed in for good measure. But then the script veers into existential, slow-burning dread. Soon enough, Lucy descends without hope into madness and her own delusions, and ultimately takes her own life. Left alone, Anna begins to experience what Lucy did as a young girl, and it's not pretty. The Human Centipede marks the point at which torture porn mania imploded on itself. Ironically, it also stands as one of the defining movies of the subgenre, and certainly one of its most famous. Loaded with a premise that defies logical explanation, The Human Centipede, with its intriguing subtitle, First Sequence, implying sequels, also had audiences feeling like the subgenre had gone too far.
Ingestion by A. The excretion of C. A human centipede.
The film tells the story of a gifted surgeon whose specialty is separating conjoined twins, but since his retirement, he has concentrated mainly on his favorite hobby, joining creatures together. In order to give himself a pet, he kidnaps 3 tourists and connects them mouth to anus so that they share a single digestive system. Yeah. After the first sequence was released, the movie was considered something of a meme, probably because people couldn't believe something like this existed. Many TV shows and films would make their own references, the result of which made the movie a reasonable success.
Good evening. Tonight, Beavis and I will be discussing a wonderful and inspiring film called The Human Centipede. In this movie, a German doctor surgically connects this chick's mouth to another chick's butt. Then he connects that chick's mouth to a Chinese dude's butt. You know, it really is uplifting.
Tonight, to help us celebrate the 3rd night of Hanukkah, please join us for the ceremonial lighting of the Human Centipede menorah.
Director Tom Six capitalized on this by making 2 sequels, but by 2015, it seemed that Six's joke had run out of steam. The Human Centipede 3, aka Final Sequence, was released that year and would end up being the last of the series, as well as Six's final film to date.
Yeah, it just started out as a very sick joke, and it grew out, it spread it like a virus all over the world, and everybody knows about it now. It's incredible. Yeah. And my goal is really to make original films. So many crap out there is all the same over and over and over, and only a few filmmakers dare to make original new things. And hopefully they did it what people want. Yeah.
2009 also saw the release of The Loved Ones. This Australian import is often described as John Hughes-inspired torture porn. It follows an awkward and shy teenage girl named Lola, who asks a young man to the school dance only to be rejected.
Will you go to the dance with me?
Sorry, Lola. I'm going with Holly.
Lola, with the help of Daddy, set up a special private dance just for her and her would-be beau, and Daddy will do anything to make his princess happy. The film is quite shocking and relentless in its brutality. A scene can switch between touching moments, like our young man and Lola slow dancing in a prom meant only for them, before switching to hard-to-watch violence like our young man getting his feet nailed to the floor. The Loved Ones adheres to the principle that if you delve into full-tilt repulsiveness wholly enough, the rest will just sort of take care of itself. You could call it torture porn, as they did at the time of its release, but then this isn't exactly hostile either. Its tone is too light, its manner too cavalier. What could have been a pedestrian kidnap and torture opus winds up being a genuine, gleefully, frenzy, bleakly, funny, sexually charged, and heart-pounding show. It's got grit, gore, suspense, and an unusually family-style drama you won't likely forget. Where to begin? An angry piece of nihilistic work, a Serbian film goes to unbelievable lengths to batter one's eyes with one ghastly image after another, an assembly line of taboos beyond the point of recognition, nearly beyond perversion. In the film, Milos, a financially struggling porn star, is coaxed into performing what is pitched to him as an art film, which promises to be his family's ticket out of Serbia. The only problem is, his new employer's lone demand is that Milos do everything he says, which includes having sex with a bruised woman after she bites his penis and riding another woman doggy style before hacking her up with a machete. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. If you're familiar with the movie, you know what we're talking about. Before it's all over, your senses will become overwhelmed and you will essentially become totally numb to the mayhem. Upon its debut on the art house circuit, the film received substantial attention and controversy for its graphic violence and sexual content. The film was ultimately banned in over 40 countries.
No fucking way, dude. That's blood.
As with many a horror subgenre, torture fatigue set in and the cycle came to its end with Saw's, quote, final chapter in 2010. A forgettable 3D installment that was met with worse than usual reviews. The film opened at number 1, but its box office was dwarfed by that of Paranormal Activity 2, suggesting audiences were tiring of brutality in the horror genre. The Saw franchise would be put on ice until 2017's Jigsaw. Further evidence that the taste of cinema goers was changing came when Saw's Wan and Winnell recombined and scored a hit with the ghost tale Insidious, released in early 2011. The same month, the Human Centipede is parodied in the season premiere of South Park, in the episode titled Human Centipede. Kyle is kidnapped and becomes the middle segment of a Human Centipede after agreeing to an iTunes user agreement.
Oh, Eric, here is your very own Human Centipede!
It does email and web browsing, and it shits in Kyle's mouth?
Speaking of which, 2011 also gave us our first Human Centipede sequel. In the first sequence, not a whole lot is actually shown, but the sequel takes the bad taste concept of its predecessor and expands it in an extraordinarily grotesque and humorously self-referential manner. The film opens rather brilliantly as the footage from the end of the first sequence transitions into, quote, real life, where Martin is watching the film at his job as a parking lot attendant / security guard. Martin is an obese weirdo who lives with his suicidal mother. He's absolutely obsessed with the first Human Centipede film and is determined to have his very own centipede one day. He is ambitious in his scope and knocks out 12 people, stapling their mouths to each other's backsides, creating a truly hellish creature. Human Centipede 2 is a brilliant response to critics of the first film. It makes a strong statement that it's just a movie and that people took it way too seriously, while also implementing a fairly unique concept. Just don't watch it after you've eaten. David Edelstein suggested in his original article that much of the multiplex horror between 2004 and 2010 was just plain nasty. Violence for the sake of violence. But whether Edelstein intended to or not, the term torture porn ended up as a blanket and often pejorative term that negatively labeled a whole range of films. Like video nasty or slasher films, torture porn is an inherently negative and reductive term. It fuses pornography and torture, rendering any film with this label as cheap and dismissible.
What are we gonna do with this one?
Leave her for the maid to clean up.
I got a better idea.
Were so-called torture porn films popular because audiences had become more sadistic? Perhaps some had. But for most, these films not only reflected the extremity of the real world, but they also allowed audiences to be scared in a way that didn't seep into their real lives. People's anxieties could be visualized on screen to provide cathartic relief. At least, this is how Eli Roth described it during his appearance on Fox News in 2004.
Anyway, grim pictures from Iraq nearly every day, and American lives lives with the threat of terrorism every hour. So it might seem surprising that horror movies are still nearly surefire bets at the box office. Gory thrillers grossing more than $1 billion last year, making up over 20% of the total films released by major studios. Joining me now is Eli Roth. He is the director of the horror flick Hostel, which comes out on DVD Tuesday. It made nearly $70 million, get this, on a budget of $5 million. If this guy were a stock, you'd buy him. Eli, good to have you.
Great to be here, Neil.
What do you think's going on? You would think that in the environment we have, the fear of terror and everything else, the last thing we'd want to be in theaters is terrorized, yet we are.
Well, the truth of the matter is, in times of terror, people want to be terrified, but in a safe environment, because with all the things that are going on in the world, certainly with the war in Iraq and the horrible, horrible aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, where our government did nothing to help anybody, you want to scream. And there really is no place in society where you can go and just scream at the top of your lungs and get it out of your system. And horror movies really provide that safe environment to do that.
All right, but with some of the horror movies, though, is it just the fact that anything's changed, or the fact we've always liked horror movies? They've always done very well, right?
Yeah, horror movies, I mean, it goes in cycles. You know, in the 70s with Vietnam, all of a sudden you had movies like Last House on the Left and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Dawn of the Dead. And then if you noticed, you know, kind of in the Clinton administration when things were calm, there weren't that many horror movies. But now, you know, thanks to George Bush and Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, there's a whole new wave of horror movies that are back.
All right, so you're blaming them for the popularity of horror movies?
No, I'm just saying that because of what's going on in the war, and because of what's happening, people have a need to scream, and people are afraid, and they're thinking about this stuff, and somehow seeing it on screen and screaming about it really gets it out of your system. It helps you deal with the terror of the things that you can't control.
But you're making a bit of a leap, Eli, to associate with some political motives here, right?
Oh, no, there's no leap whatsoever. I mean, if you talk to all the horror directors of the 70s, they say that they were making films as a reaction to watching Vietnam on television. And I can tell you right now that, you know, Americans feel like their security is their army and their money. And we're in this war now, and you feel like it's never going to end, and the people we're fighting don't care about our money. They're going to cut your head off. Everybody's clicked on the internet and seen those videos of people being decapitated. And it's really terrifying. And our army, which used to be so strong and so powerful, you feel like it's really disorganized right now. It really feels like a bunch of scared kids that just want to go home. And you can see all these generals that are coming out now saying, get Rumsfeld the hell out of there. And I think that the horror movies that are being made are definitely a reaction to this fear.
You have a bias. You don't flip over this administration or the people leading the war. That's fair. But I don't remember, like, we went through 8 years of the Clinton administration without a single horror movie that was popular.
Well, I think that Scream came out, and that was a popular horror movie. But, you know, it all comes in waves and cycles. I think at the end of the 80s, you know, horror movies became a joke. It was all sequels, and you know, there was a real kind of backlash against movie violence.
So wait a minute,
but
when
now,
Psycho came out when John Kennedy was president, was that an indictment of John Kennedy, or was Psycho just a great flick?
No, Psycho was an indictment about Ed Gein. And suddenly, that mass murderer, nobody had ever seen anything like that. That here's this guy from small-town Wisconsin, and he's cutting people off, and he's cutting people's heads off, and he's wearing their skins.
But it had nothing to do with politics,
It was so
right?
shocking
Nothing
to
to do
the
with
country that
politics at
Psycho
all.
was very much a response to that.
Okay.
I'm sorry, what was that?
It had nothing to do with politics, right?
Well, no, I don't think Psycho did. I think that Psycho felt like you could be living next door to somebody who seems like a nice guy and is a mass murderer.
Okay.
And that's actually something that's pretty relevant today with someone like the BTK killer.
All right. Eli Roth, Hostile Director, thank you very much.
Thank you, Neil Favuto. It's my pleasure to be here.
Same here.
Looking back at horror films from the early to mid 2000s and the climate of fear and government-condoned torture, it is hardly surprising that films detailing these things did so well at the box office. Audiences have long been thrilled by being scared and seeing violence on screen. As the real world has gone through cycles of collective fear and threatened or actual violence, the horror genre has responded in kind. Yes, many films from this cycle were vomit-inducingly savage and often devoid of artistic merit or political context. But the term torture porn risks overlooking a body of work, which could tell us a great deal about what was going on in the world and how people felt about it.
Game over.
The people who see these films have a real sense of humor about the films, about John Kramer, about the experiences that they've had. Surprisingly, they don't take the films anywhere near as seriously as the people who don't see the films. People who don't see the films or don't want to see the films or feel that the films are too much or that kind, they take them very seriously.